I began exploring cautiously, sticking to walls and shaded areas. I found a small armory under the maintenance shed, mostly tranquilizer guns for the animals, not exactly weapons against a horde of undead humans. But one bolt-action rifle caught my eye, along with a handful of rounds. It wasn't much, but it was something. The trigger felt heavy in my hands, the weight of survival suddenly tangible. Food was my next problem. The cafeteria was ransacked by panicked visitors, but I discovered that most of the animal feed could sustain me for a while. High-protein pellets, grains, and even canned supplements strange, but enough to keep my energy up. I rationed carefully. I didn't want to waste a single calorie. Survival, I realized, was more mental than physical. Every day I spent thinking, observing, calculating, watching the infected, noting patterns, learning their weaknesses. I also realized something terrifying. Some animals sensed it too. The lions, usually lazy, prowled their enclosures in tense, low circles. Birds shrieked incessantly, warning of intrusions or perhaps sensing death in the air. I stayed close to them when possible, using their instincts as an early warning system. At the same time, I couldn't let myself become attached. Emotional bonds were dangerous, and now they made you slow, indecisive. I had to survive, and that meant detachment. On the third day, I encountered my first human threat beyond the infected. A man, maybe my age, crouched behind a food cart near the reptile house. He froze when he saw me, eyes wide, gun shaking in his hands. He wasn't infected, but neither was he friendly. Survival brought out the worst in people. We exchanged cautious words, each trying to gauge if the other was a threat. Eventually, he retreated silently, disappearing into the shadows, leaving me uneasy. If there were others like him, human predators would become as much a concern as the undead. By the end of that first week, I'd set up a routine. I moved during the day, scavenging supplies, checking on enclosures, marking safe routes. I avoided the infected whenever possible, striking only when necessary. Nights were spent in the administration building, barricading doors, listening, waiting, and thinking. I started keeping a journal, both to record events and to keep my mind sharp. The pages filled with sketches of the zoo, notes about animal behavior, and, occasionally, desperate reminders. Stay alert, don't get careless, survive. And then, on the 8th day, something happened that changed everything. I was checking the aviary, tossing some seed along the paths to keep the birds calm, when I heard it, a guttural growl, deep and resonant, coming from the far end of the park. Not human, not infected, something massive. I froze. The sound vibrated through the metal cages, through the ground, rattling my teeth. Something was coming, something alive. And it wasn't going to ask permission to cross paths with me. I never imagined that my last day at the zoo would be my first day of survival. I used to stroll the paths between enclosures, checking the cages, feeding schedules, and the occasional lazy tiger basking in the sun. The familiar smells of hay, animal musk, and faint antiseptic were comforting, but the day it started, all that comfort evaporated. It began as a rumor, a virus outbreak somewhere downtown, but at first I didn't pay it much mind. We're in the middle of the city. A few infections here and there aren't unusual. But by mid-afternoon, the chaos was undeniable. Visitors were panicked, screaming in a language of terror I could never forget. Guards were chasing a group of people, trying to corral them away from the gates, but it was futile. One of the visitors fell and got up strangely, jerking and twitching before biting another. The first scream pierced through the usual hum of the zoo like a knife, and I knew then that this was no ordinary emergency. The security radios crackled with warnings, but the messages were garbled, panicked. I didn't have time to make a proper plan. My instincts, call it habit or sheer luck, kicked in. I headed to the staff area and grabbed the emergency keys, my heart hammering in my chest. From the cage of the lemurs to the lions, everyone was beginning to panic or worse, become something unrecognizable. I remember the orangutan banging the glass, a mixture of curiosity and fear in its eyes, and I thought, not for the last time, that the animals might be smarter than us. I barricaded myself inside the administration building when the first wave of infected visitors surged into the main plaza. Through the reinforced windows, I watched people stumble and collapse. Their skin paled unnaturally, their eyes glazed. There was no reasoning with them. One man lunged at a guard, teeth bared, and the guard went down in seconds. The animals, usually the most terrifying of creatures, now seemed almost safer. At least, they didn't attack on instinct alone, mostly. I scavenged the building for supplies, first aid kits, food, water, anything that could buy me time. In the kitchen, I found some canned goods and a few bottles of water. Not much, but enough for a day or two if I rationed carefully. I grabbed a fire extinguisher, not knowing if I'd ever use it. Better to have it than wish I did later. The zoo's map was tacked to the wall, and I memorized every exit, enclosure, and possible hiding spot. Knowledge would be my weapon. Maybe more than a baseball bat, maybe more than a gun, which I couldn't find yet. By nightfall, the zoo had transformed. The distant hum of the city was gone, replaced by moans and occasional snarls. Shadows moved unnaturally in the dim emergency lights. I could hear the rustle of feet, human, not animal, shuffling along paths that once smelled like popcorn and cotton candy. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Sleep was a luxury for the living, and I wasn't sure how long I'd remain among them. By morning, I realized the zoo wasn't just a shelter, it was a fortress, if I could control it. The fences, the gates, the enclosures, they were barriers the infected couldn't easily overcome. The tiger and lion cages were still locked. The primates were restless but contained. The elephants, well, they were unpredictable. But I reasoned that if I kept my distance, they'd be my silent allies. At least they weren't trying to eat me. The growl lingered in my ears long after I'd retreated to the administration building. I couldn't identify it. Too low, too resonant to be any of the usual predators in the zoo. The lions, the tigers, they made noise, sure, but this was different, deliberate, calculated, something alive and bigger than anything I'd seen behind bars. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the central plaza, creeping along maintenance paths, scanning the shadows. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made me jump. My nerves were stretched tight, a taut string, ready to snap. By the second day after the growl, the zoo had changed yet again. The infected were becoming bolder, more coordinated in their wandering. They didn't run anymore. They didn't stumble as much. They moved in clusters now, a slow, shambling pack that could corner someone if I wasn't careful. I had a few close encounters. One tried to grab me through the mesh fence of the reptile house. Its hands were cold and rigid, its eyes milky and vacant. I shoved a fire extinguisher through the opening in panic, feeling it hit its skull with a satisfying thud. But it kept coming, its jaw snapping, drool dripping. I backed away, heart hammering, realizing for the first time that the infected weren't stupid. They adapted in their own grotesque way. The mysterious growl from the other night didn't help. Every shadow in the animal enclosures felt alive. I started moving differently, scanning 360 degrees, keeping my back to walls when possible. The elephants, who usually wandered slowly in their pen, were now always at the farthest corner, ears flicking nervously. The zebras stamped and whinnied whenever I approached. Animals sensed the danger I couldn't fully comprehend, reacting in ways that were almost human, and maybe that was my lifeline. Observing them, understanding their instincts, became crucial to my survival. By the fourth day, food was running low. The canned supplies in the staff kitchen wouldn't last more than a week if I didn't ration carefully, and the animal feed, while useful, was monotonous. My stomach ached from hunger, but I refused to panic. Hunger sharpened focus. Panic would get me killed faster than the infected ever could. I scavenged further into the zoo, checking storage sheds, abandoned vendor carts, and even the maintenance tunnels that ran under the reptile house. Each step outside my temporary fortress was a risk, but also necessary. I needed supplies, information, and a sense of control over this chaotic place that had once been so mundane. It was in those tunnels that I first saw them other survivors. Two of them, a man and a woman, both exhausted and filthy, crouched in the shadows near a stack of crates. They looked up at me like I was another threat, guns shaking in hands that had clearly not fired in days. I raised my hand slowly, showing I meant no immediate harm. We exchanged wary words. Names were exchanged: Tom, the man, and Elise, the woman. Both had been wandering the city before ending up here, scavenging like me, surviving on sheer luck and instinct. Their story mirrored mine: chaos, death, and the slow realization that the world as we knew it was gone. We decided, hesitantly, to work together. Strength in numbers, we rationalized, but trust was fragile. Every glance, every twitch of the eye carried suspicion. I noticed Elise flinch at a distant growl long before I even heard it. Tom cursed quietly under his breath every time a bird shrieked. Survival wasn't just about fighting the infected. It was about understanding human fear, both in others and in yourself. Together, we fortified the small storage room near the reptile house. Using metal shelves, crates, and whatever furniture we could drag, we built a barricade strong enough to resist a small group of infected. We shared supplies, canned goods, bottled water, and a few scraps of dried meat we had found near the carnivore enclosures. That night, for the first time in days, I slept in a semblance of safety. Not peacefully, of course. My dreams were haunted by snarling shadows and crawling figures, but I slept, and that was something. The next morning, the threat of the mysterious growl returned. Elise suggested we leave the storage room to scout it out, maybe figure out what was making that sound. But I disagreed at first. It was reckless. But curiosity gnawed at me. Maybe understanding this new threat was necessary if we were going to survive here. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find. Tom had found a makeshift spear in the maintenance tunnels, and Elise carried a heavy wrench. I kept the bolt-action rifle, feeling its weight and the responsibility it represented. We moved cautiously, following the sound through the elephant and giraffe enclosures. The growl came again, echoing off the concrete walls. And then I saw it, a creature unlike anything I had ever imagined. Its body was massive, far larger than a lion, covered in mottled fur and scarred from some unknown past. Its eyes glowed faintly in the shadows, intelligent. It didn't attack immediately. It watched us, measuring, assessing. My instincts screamed to fire, to strike first, but something held me back. I realized this wasn't infected. This was something else. Perhaps it had survived the initial outbreak, or maybe it was a mutation of some kind, an apex predator adapted to this new world. We backed away slowly, never breaking eye contact. The creature didn't follow, but it didn't leave either. It was an unspoken warning. The zoo was no longer just a refuge from the infected. By the third week, the zoo had become something unrecognizable. The carefully curated gardens were overrun with weeds and overturned planters. Fences sagged under the weight of branches and debris. The infected wandered endlessly, a slow, relentless tide. And then there were the humans, Tom, Elise, and I, were no longer the only ones attempting to carve out survival here. It began subtly. Voices at night, low murmurs we didn't recognize, footsteps echoing on the concrete paths, too deliberate to be animals. We spotted figures moving near the tiger enclosure, silhouetted against the moonlight. They weren't infected, but they weren't friendly either. Survival had turned everyone into a potential threat. Trust was a currency in short supply, and I had none to spare. We decided to investigate. Armed with the rifle, spear, and wrench, we moved silently through the zoo's central corridor. The air was thick with the stench of decay, both human and animal, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Every shadow seemed to breathe, every rustle of leaves a warning. Then we saw them, a small band of survivors, maybe 6 or 7, scavenging near the lion enclosures. One of them spotted us and shouted a panicked, frantic yell that echoed across the empty zoo. In seconds, the sound brought a swarm of infected from the perimeter, drawn like moths to a flame. Chaos erupted. The creatures surged toward the group, moaning and snapping. The humans scattered, some running into the enclosures, others stumbling into paths where the infected could trap them. We fired sparingly. The rifle barked once, twice, and then silence as the first shot hit its mark. But the numbers were overwhelming. I realized then that bullets were a temporary solution. Ingenuity would be our real weapon. Tom grabbed a flare from the supply pack we had salvaged, tossing it into the path of the advancing infected. It created a brief wall of fire and light, and we pulled back into the shadows. Elisa's eyes were wide, heart hammering, but there was resolve there. We couldn't save everyone, and we couldn't stay in the open. We moved, calculating every step, using the zoo's natural barriers, the fences, the enclosures, the gates to funnel and slow the infected. Somehow, against all odds, we survived the night. The other survivors weren't so lucky. When we circled back at dawn, the remnants of the group lay scattered, either turned or worse. It was a harsh reminder. In this world, hesitation meant death. Survival demanded decisiveness, ruthlessness. The apex predator, the massive, fur-covered creature we had glimpsed days earlier, remained an enigma. I spotted it once near the giraffe enclosure, crouched silently among the shadows. Its eyes reflected the morning light, intelligent and calculating. It didn't attack the infected, didn't interact with the humans, but it seemed to understand the chaos unfolding. It was neither friend nor foe, simply a force of nature asserting itself in this broken world. By the 4th week, we had established a tentative base in the reptile house. Its thick concrete walls and narrow corridors gave us some protection. We rigged improvised barricades, stacked crates, and set up early warning systems, strings tied to cans that would clatter if the infected approached. The animal feed kept us going, supplemented by the occasional canned goods we scavenged. But hunger was a constant shadow, gnawing at our concentration. Human conflict, I realized, was as dangerous as the infected. Elise and I had a narrow argument one evening over rationing. She wanted to take more than her share of the food, reasoning that she was stronger and could survive a longer journey outside. I refused, insisting on fairness. Tom mediated, but the tension lingered. In this world, morality was a fragile illusion, easily shattered by desperation. I understood it now, in a way I never could have imagined when I walked through the zoo's gates weeks ago. One night, the growl returned, louder, closer, and filled with a sense of purpose. The creature moved through the zoo with predatory grace, unbothered by the infected and indifferent to us. It was hunting something, or maybe just asserting its dominance. I followed it from a distance, careful to remain unseen. In a clearing near the old primate enclosures, it cornered a pair of infected tearing through them with terrifying efficiency. There was no mercy, no hesitation. The days blurred together. Hunger gnawed, thirst pricked, and the endless moans of the infected echoed through the zoo like a slow, persistent drumbeat. The tension between Tom, Elise, and me had grown into a silent friction. Every glance, every decision carried unspoken accusations. Survival had become a careful balance between logic and instinct, trust and suspicion. It began early one morning. We had decided to scavenge the carnivore enclosures, hoping to find more food and perhaps some weapons from abandoned supply lockers. The air was thick with heat and the pungent smell of predators. Lions paced behind bars, their muscles coiled and eyes gleaming, while tigers lounged lazily but tracked every movement. I kept the rifle raised, moving with deliberate caution, each step measured. Then I saw them. Humans, another group of survivors, maybe 4 or 5 rifles in hand, moving cautiously along the paths near the tiger cages. I froze. One of them spotted us, a man with a wild look in his eyes, and shouted. In an instant, chaos erupted. Shots rang out, ricocheting against metal fences, echoing through the cages. The lions roared, tigers leapt and snarled, and the infected in the distance were drawn to the noise. Elise and Tom dove for cover behind overturned crates. I fired, hitting one of the humans in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. The others scattered. But the noise had attracted more than just human attention. The infected poured into the area from every direction, shuffling, moaning, relentless. My heart pounded. The zoo had become a death trap, a battlefield in which every decision carried lethal consequences. Then a low, resonant growl cut through the chaos. The apex predator emerged from the shadows, massive and terrifying, its fur matted but sleek, eyes gleaming with intelligence. It moved with the precision of a hunter, tearing into the infected with brutal efficiency. Limbs flew, bones snapped, and the creatures that had seemed unstoppable moments before fell like wheat before a scythe. Tom and Elise stared in awe, their fear mingling with a strange, primal respect. I didn't lower the rifle. I couldn't, but for the first time since the outbreak began, I realized we weren't entirely powerless. This creature, this apex predator, was a force of nature allied with no one but itself. And yet, by targeting the infected, it had given us a chance. We took advantage of the chaos, retreating toward the maintenance tunnels and barricading the entrances behind us. The other humans were gone, or perhaps dead. Either outcome didn't matter. Survival meant moving forward, not dwelling on those who failed to adapt. In the following days, we began to understand the predator's patterns. It moved silently through the zoo at night, hunting the infected, and occasionally observing us from the shadows. It never attacked directly, never engaged us, but its presence altered the environment. Paths that had been impassable became navigable. Enclosures that had once felt like traps were now temporary safe zones, provided we respected the creature's territory. We established a more secure base in the reptile house, reinforcing the barricades and setting up traps using leftover fencing and chains from the enclosures. We rationed our food meticulously, scavenged what we could, and kept watch in shifts. Nights were tense, filled with distant moans and the occasional roar of the predators. I found myself relying not just on weapons or human ingenuity, but on observation, watching the animals, reading their behavior, anticipating the infected, and respecting the apex predator's unspoken rules. But survival wasn't just about observation. One afternoon, a supply run to the giraffe enclosure went horribly wrong. We had spotted a cache of canned goods behind the maintenance shed, guarded by a small pack of infected. I planned our approach carefully, moving silently, signaling Tom and Elise to follow. But just as we reached the crates, One of the infected lunged unexpectedly. The fight was brutal. Tom grabbed a pipe, swinging with all his strength, while Elise tried to distract the creature. I fired the rifle, the recoil shaking my arms, and the infected collapsed, but not before scratching Elise's arm. Panic surged through us. We retreated into the giraffe pen, the animals calm but towering above us like silent witnesses. Elise's wound wasn't deep, but it was a warning. Infection wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it was a slow, creeping doom. We treated it with what little we had: alcohol, rags, and a crude bandage. But the incident reminded us we were fragile, and even small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. The apex predator returned that night. We saw it from the rooftop of the reptile house, crouched silently among the trees. Its gaze was fixed on something in the distance, another group of infected, or perhaps a human trespasser. I realized then that it wasn't our ally, not really, but its presence shaped the battlefield in ways we could exploit. The tension had reached a breaking point. Weeks of constant vigilance, hunger, and fear had taken their toll on all of us. Tom had begun snapping at the smallest things, slamming doors, muttering under his breath. Elise, normally calm and calculating, was growing reckless, suggesting dangerous scavenges for food. And I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, harder each day. One wrong move could end everything. That morning, we spotted smoke rising from the direction of the old elephant enclosure. Someone or something had started a fire. Cautiously, we approached. The smell of smoke mixed with burning hay and scorched earth filled the air. And then we saw them, a new group of humans, armed and desperate, rifling through supplies and making makeshift barricades of metal fencing and cages. They spotted us immediately. Weapons were raised. Words were exchanged, but they were meaningless. Survival had eroded civility entirely. One of them, a tall man with a shotgun, shouted that we should leave or die. I knew he wasn't bluffing. The standoff was tense, the infected wandering nearby, adding an unpredictable element. Negotiation failed quickly. Shots rang out, echoing across the zoo. Tom and Elise dove for cover while I fired the rifle, hitting one of the attackers in the leg. Chaos erupted. The infected, drawn by the noise, began to converge on the firefight. Lions and tigers roared from their enclosures, agitated by the commotion. It was in this chaos that the apex predator made its move. From the shadows near the giraffe pens, it launched itself at one of the human aggressors. The man never had a chance. The predator's power and precision were terrifying. The infected were trampled, scattered, or killed in the ensuing chaos. For a few brief minutes, it was as if nature itself had intervened on our side. But we didn't celebrate. We retreated toward the reptile house, dragging an injured Tom with us. His leg was badly mangled, a deep bite that had already started to turn dark. Elise and I worked frantically, using makeshift splints and cloth to stabilize him. The smell of blood was everywhere, thick and cloying. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that he wouldn't survive long without proper care. As night fell, the zoo became a maze of moans, growls, and distant fires. The apex predator was nowhere in sight. Its presence felt only in the way the infected avoided certain paths, as if some unspoken boundary kept them at bay. I wondered if it had been watching us all along, a silent guardian or perhaps a judge, testing our ability to adapt. The next day, we knew we had to make a choice. Tom's leg was beyond saving. He insisted we leave him behind if we wanted to survive. Elise argued fiercely, refusing to abandon him. I felt torn, the weight of leadership pressing down like a physical force. With heavy hearts, we carried Tom to a secluded corner of the zoo. behind the old reptile ponds. He looked at us with a mix of defiance and acceptance. "Go," he whispered, his voice strained. We didn't argue. We left him there, barricading the area as best we could with crates and fencing. It was a brutal lesson. The apocalypse demanded sacrifices, and even loyalty had limits. After leaving Tom, the dynamic between Elise and me shifted. Grief mingled with determination. We scavenged more aggressively, set up traps, and mapped the zoo with precision. The infected were no longer just obstacles, they were part of the environment, predictable in their patterns, but deadly in their numbers. We adapted. Every day was a battle of wits, reflexes, and endurance. Then the apex predator returned, emerging from the shadows near the aviary. Its eyes met mine, unblinking, intelligent, and somehow assessing. For the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt respect, a primal acknowledgement of strength and dominance. It moved silently past us, ignoring the infected, ignoring the burned and wrecked enclosures, as if it understood we were different. Survivors. We realized that the predator could be a crucial element in our survival strategy. By moving through its territory, observing its hunting patterns, and timing our actions, we could navigate the zoo in ways that minimized risk. It wasn't an ally, not really, but in this world, even neutral forces could be leveraged. That night, we planned our most ambitious move yet. We would secure the central supply storage, a warehouse near the main gates. It was heavily fortified, but it held food, water, and medical supplies, everything we needed to sustain ourselves for weeks, perhaps months. We set out at dusk, moving silently through the overgrown paths, keeping to the shadows. The roar of a lion echoed nearby. The moans of infected, punctuated by distant gunfire. Every step was a gamble, but the alternative, waiting and starving, was worse. As we approached the warehouse, I felt the presence of the apex predator nearby. It was watching, patient, a force of nature indifferent to our intentions, but capable of shaping the outcome. The night was far from over. The warehouse loomed ahead like a fortress carved from the city's remnants. Its corrugated metal walls were rusted, patched in places. But it promised more than shelter. It promised survival. Food, water, and medical supplies waited inside, just out of reach, guarded by the relentless infected and perhaps other humans. Every instinct screamed danger, but hunger and desperation left us no choice. Elise and I approached cautiously, keeping low among the overgrown paths and fallen signage. The smell of rot was thick, mingling with the faint tang of spilled chemicals from the old maintenance shed. I kept the rifle raised, scanning for movement, while Elise gripped her wrench tightly, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Then we saw them, another group of survivors, 5 or 6, barricading the main entrance. Guns and makeshift weapons glinted in the dim light. They were alert, hostile, and clearly not interested in negotiation. One shouted, accusing us of being intruders. I realized instantly we had no option but to fight. Shots rang out. The humans fired first, forcing us to dive for cover behind overturned crates. My rifle barked, taking down one of them, but there were too many. The infected, drawn by the gunfire, began to shuffle closer, adding chaos to an already volatile situation. And then it appeared, the apex predator, moving silently along the perimeter. It was massive, its presence commanding attention. It didn't attack us, but it began hunting the humans and infected alike, tearing through the chaos with terrifying precision. In the carnage, we saw opportunity. We used the predator's attacks as cover, moving closer to the warehouse entrance, our hearts pounding. Elise ducked behind me, whispering, "We can make it if we stay close to it. I nodded. We slipped inside the warehouse, slamming the doors behind us. Inside, the smell of canned food, water, and supplies was intoxicating. It was a haven, but it felt fragile, temporary. Every crash, every groan from outside reminded us that the world beyond these walls had not paused. Survival demanded vigilance, not comfort. We scavenged supplies quickly. Food, water, medical kits, and even a few firearms lay scattered across the dusty shelves. Each item we collected was a lifeline. Elise patched up my scratches. I helped tend to her bruises. For a moment, amidst the chaos, we allowed ourselves a fleeting sense of relief. But survival was never permanent. Through the warehouse's high windows, we saw movement outside, more infected, drawn to the commotion from the fight. And more humans, survivors who saw opportunity in chaos. We realized that our stay here would be brief if we didn't act decisively. Tom's absence hung over me. Leaving him behind had been the hardest decision yet, but it had been necessary. His survival had become impossible, and our focus had to remain on staying alive. That night, we set up traps around the warehouse, strings tied to cans, barricades reinforced with shelves, even a few flammable improvised devices designed to deter intruders. The apex predator returned, silently observing from a distance. I could feel its gaze. Weeks passed. The warehouse became our fortress, a base from which we could plan, observe, and survive. The infected grew bolder, but we had learned their patterns. The humans were dangerous, unpredictable, but manageable if we stayed alert. And the apex predator remained, a shadow that commanded respect and caution. And then, one morning, it happened. A massive horde of infected, drawn together by some instinctive pull, surged toward the warehouse. Dozens, maybe hundreds, their moans filling the air like a tidal wave of death. Simultaneously, the remaining human threats converged, seeing an opportunity to seize our supplies. It was a perfect storm, a simultaneous attack from every direction. We fought, barricaded, and used every trick we had learned. The predator emerged amidst the chaos, tearing through the infected with brutal efficiency. Its eyes met mine briefly, almost acknowledging our presence, our ingenuity, our determination. The humans, unprepared for the combined chaos of predator and horde, faltered, retreating or falling. When the dust settled, silence returned. The warehouse, battered but standing, had survived the onslaught. The apex predator had disappeared, leaving only the aftermath. Bodies, human and infected alike, lay scattered, a grim testament to the brutal rules of this world. Elise and I stood amidst the wreckage, exhausted but alive. The morning was eerily quiet. The haze of smoke from distant fires hung in the air, turning the sun into a dull, blood-colored disk. Elise and I moved cautiously through the warehouse, checking supplies and fortifying our barricades. Months of survival had taught us one thing: calm was always temporary. Danger could erupt at any moment. And it did. It started with distant moaning, a low, guttural chorus that grew steadily louder. Through the shattered windows, I saw movement, a writhing mass of infected moving as one toward the warehouse. Their numbers were staggering, far greater than anything we'd faced before. Panic threatened to take hold, but I pushed it down. Survival demanded clarity. "Elise," I whispered, "we have to lure them into the open. There's no way we can hold them all in here." She nodded grimly. "And the humans?" I shook my head. "We deal with them when they show themselves. Focus on the horde first." We moved outside, carrying flares, bottles of fuel, and anything that could ignite. Our plan was desperate, dangerous, but necessary. draw the infected into the zoo's central plaza, trap them with fire, and funnel them toward the apex predator's hunting territory. It worked better than I expected. The infected, driven by blind instinct, followed the flames and noise, stumbling into paths we had mapped for weeks. The predator emerged from the shadows, massive and terrifying, its eyes glowing in the flickering light. It attacked with terrifying precision, tearing through the horde like a force of nature. Limbs flew, screams echoed, and chaos became a weapon we could exploit. Then came the humans. The group that had attacked us before returned. Seeing the horde as an opportunity, they fired recklessly, killing some infected, but also putting themselves in the predator's path. In a heartbeat, the creature turned on them not maliciously, not with malice, but with lethal efficiency. By the time we reached them, the humans were either dead or fleeing in terror, leaving the supplies untouched. Elise and I didn't hesitate. We moved through the battlefield, grabbing what we needed, avoiding the predator's line of sight, and keeping our wits about us. The horde had thinned, the human threat eliminated, and the apex predator, satisfied or indifferent, receded back into the shadows, leaving the zoo in an uneasy silence. By midday, we stood in the center of the zoo's plaza, surrounded by the aftermath. The infected were gone, scattered or destroyed. The humans were either dead or fled. The apex predator, the silent force that had shaped our survival, was nowhere to be seen. We were alone. Exhausted, covered in grime and blood, we finally allowed ourselves to breathe. The zoo had tested us in every way, physically, mentally, emotionally. We had lost friends, faced death countless times, and been forced to make impossible decisions. I looked at Elise. She was bruised and scratched. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, now held a quiet, hard-earned respect. "We made it," she said softly. "Yeah," I replied. "We made it." We scavenged the remaining supplies, fortified the warehouse as best we could, and began to plan our next steps. The world beyond the zoo was still dangerous, filled with infected, hostile humans and unknown threats. But we had learned to adapt. We had learned to survive.